I'm Afza Wajid. As I was saying, I'm part of SaaS Factory, and I've been with AWS for a little over 2 years now, 2 years and 4 months to be exact. I specifically work a lot with startups. I lead the SaaS Factory engagement for the startup segment here in Neymar, and doing some work with Jomas also in EMEA. And you should be able to see my screen now. Please holler if you're not able to see it. Um,
Yes, I can see Esther is pricing and packaging.
okay, great, awesome. Thank you. Um, all right, I don't know why my video won't show. I apologize, but hopefully it'll fix itself. It seems to still be spinning when I click on start video. But as we get into this topic, I'm going to start with speaking about some of the foundational elements of pricing. If you watched our prior pricing webinar, or if you have, if you've done a bunch of your own research in pricing, some of this might seem very basic and maybe even repetitive, but bear with me. I'll try to go through the initial slides quickly just to level set and make sure that everybody is, sort of at the same level when we start. And then we'll spend as much time as possible towards the end really talking through a few examples. Because as I see it, pricing is kind of like math. You can look at and read all the theory you want, but unless you actually work through some of the examples, it's kind of hard to really get a good handle. So with that, let me start off. So first of all, pricing in general is tricky and complex, but SaaS pricing in particular, and why you hear so much around it, is it's it's a little bit more complex, and we'll look at first of all why that is. So as a starting point, in SaaS, there is a general expectation from, and you're all, startups at different sort of, different stages of that startup life cycle. But essentially, regardless of where you're at, the mid to long-term expectations for investors is that, excuse me, is that you will, be able to expand your total addressable market and scale up or down, depending on where you started, across customer segments, across geographies, across verticals, across the type of users, across personas in a SaaS product very easily compared to, or relatively more easily than you would in in a traditional software product. And that is sort of table stakes, and that is something that investors actively look for. And for a lot of times, companies will start too broad, and then it's kind of like a race to the finish before you run out of funding. How do you get to the the sort of minimum viable product, if I can call it that, but really product market fit is what you're looking at, and still prove your use case and prove your value. So generally, if you're sort of grappling with where do I go, how do I start, what's my starting point, the recommendation in, again, use case specific, a lot of nuance here, but the general expectation is that, or general recommendation is that you start narrow, start with a very specific use case, refine, optimize, and then expand. Which means that in pricing, all of that must reflect that same journey that you make along product must also reflect along pricing. So for instance, if you started with enterprise, in SaaS, the expectation is you'll be able to move up to strategics. When I say strategics, it can be verticals that are nuanced, like healthcare or government. It can be very large customers. It can also be very specific niche companies. Like if you're trying to sell into the genomics market, right? Like a company like Illumina becomes very key to that. So depending on whatever your use case is, being able to sort of go up to those strategics or come all the way down to the mid-market small businesses, and depending on the nature of your product, even individual users and prosumers. So think of companies like Box and Dropbox that really span the gamut, right? And essentially what you're looking at is also pricing models to change with it. So it's not like, okay, I set a contract, an unlimited contract, and I just, sign up a telecom provider and I'm good. This is the buying preferences and how companies, even want to account for it as CapEx or OpEx changes. And based on how that changes on their side, your pricing model will need to also change, and how you oftentimes it's not even one model for one kind of customer. What do I mean by that? If you look at enterprise software and the buying trends in the last few years, there is a clear pattern where companies are, before a large enterprise can sign a multi-year contract, there are one, two, three key decision makers that want to now try your product. So they're almost procuring your product like they are an individual user or a small business. And then that's leading to your contract. Similarly, if a large enterprise has a greenfield unit that they don't really know how much it'll grow in the next 3 years, they might start off in the first 6 months to a year when the uncertainty is high to actually, buy as a low risk purchase, right? So you're essentially looking at buying in a pay as you go model or a subscription model. Those are cases that we see very concretely, even if you're selling just to the enterprise or to those strategic customers. So that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. The second thing is, and this is tricky, and I've shown it as an arrow, it's more of a loop here, honestly. Um, the business case really sort of sets the requirements. The architecture typically should follow those business, requirements. That then determines cost, and that becomes the lower bound of your pricing. So that is really important, and something that a lot of startups in particular might do the other way, right? We're all engineers, we're all builders, and when we as a startup, we want to build something, we want to bring a product to market quickly. And the tricky part in SaaS is that how you build that and how you architect that can very significantly change your cost model, and that then directly impacts how you can price if you want to be profitable from the get-go, or at whatever point on the spectrum you want to be profitable. And so start with the business requirements is a recommendation we strongly make. Identify those key customer segments, identify what they're willing to pay for it. If you're selling to a Lockheed Martin, right, cost is much less of a factor. If you're selling to a large semiconductor provider like Intel, or chip manufacturer, sorry, like an Intel, they are not very worried about that cost. They have other considerations, right? Security, and is my data safe in the cloud? They don't want a shared model. That will determine whether you do single tenant, multi-tenant. And if you're going across the spectrum, like if you look at drug discovery or semiconductor, HPC, you'll see that in those scenarios, there are these startups who are okay with buying where there's very little IP risk to them in the initial stages. They're okay to buy in a multi-tenant model, and you're much better off building that as a multi-tenant. If you go all the way up, say the big pharma or the big semiconductor chip manufacturers, they want everything siloed and they're willing to pay for it. So how do you really architect in a way that you're not maintaining these multiple instances, but able to go across the spectrum, even even if you're very flexible in terms of your pricing model? And then the last thing here that I want to highlight is just the optimization. So SaaS pricing is not set and forget. SaaS pricing, you need to keep optimizing. I am yet to have worked with a partner, and I've probably touched about 70 plus just this year. I'm in obviously last year as well, but I'm yet to see a partner who has not changed their pricing in the first 2, 3, 4 years, right? Pricing continues to evolve, and you can even look at some of the very successful SaaS companies like Snowflake. We'll actually dive into the example later in the session, but they're a company that has also significantly evolved how they price in the nuances. At the face of it, it might look fairly similar, but as they go along, and as Profitwell found from their study, there's a significant lift in LTV to cost of acquisition ratio when companies are continually optimizing rather than just doing a 1 year annual review or no review at all. And So let's start with some basic, guidelines for SaaS pricing. And please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat here, or feel free to just interrupt me. Want to make this, useful to you and your use cases here. It's kind of tricky to do this in a group just because pricing is so different for each use case. But at the same time, some of those fundamentals can, be quite uniform across the board. Um, So first thing to ask is the fundamental questions, right? A lot of this is common across SaaS or non-SaaS pricing. Um, Customer reach is, you start with a customer, right? At AWS, we always talk about working backwards from the customer. There are these key target segments, verticals, geographies that you're always going to look at and say, who is buying my product and how are they buying it? Who am I reaching? Who's key for success? Um, and then you're sort of identifying your pricing model. The key here is to also add personas, simply because in SaaS, you have that direct link to the end user. You're able to control that experience, and you're able to directly encourage and initiate upsells and resells and higher engagement. So it's not just the buyer here, but it's also the end user or the different personas that you're selling to. Stripe's a good example. AWS is a good example. We ourselves sell a lot to developers, right? Developers starting to become a key persona in particularly B2B SaaS applications. And how do you really refine the experience? And we did a webinar with them, with Stripe and CrowdStrike and Snowflake last month. And one thing that their head of platform sales, Kate Jensen, called out was, we actually, built for the, or Stripe, what she said was that Stripe actually built for that developer persona, which meant that, yeah, they made the product very, APIs and all of that great stuff, but they also had documentation where developers could just read through and get what they were, doing, right? So there was elements of that that also then translate into how they were pricing and how companies were, how these developers were able to buy the service. So very easy to start using Stripe and also pay for it. Target customers, how they're willing to buy. I mean, this is important just because everybody's moving to subscriptions, but hold on, not really, right? There are a number of articles out there by different agency or different consulting firms that talk about, yeah, there's a huge move to subscription, but it's still, there's so much more to do and there's such a long way to go. Sometimes customers are just not ready to buy in a certain model, pay as you go, for example. Telecom, classic example. They want unlimited contracts, and it's, they're very capex focused. So you might need to, if not change your pricing to suit it alone, you might also need to explain how those accounting rules come into play if you are selling into those markets. Because actually, you can have at least a certain percentage of your spend accounted for as capex in a subscription model. And there are certain guidelines of how you do that. And again, depending on the accounting guidelines you're following, there might be some nuance. So adding, not just aligning your pricing model, but also including those in your sales plays and sharing that with your sales teams, making sure they're trained and able to have those conversations with customers. On the product value side, obviously you price for product in a traditional software model, but here keep in mind that you're operating the service. We'll double click into the, the cost piece of this a little bit more later in the presentation, but operations is the big part of it. You own the, operating the service is your business, right? When you're delivering SaaS. And so you are responsible for the operations, for making sure it's up and running, but also for any liability or risk that comes with it. And so if you're taking on more risk and you're taking on potentially more liability, then obviously you want that to be priced in as well. And the cost to really build, market, and operate, and I touched on this, we'll dive into the different cost categories a little later in the presentation. And lastly, what if any competitive considerations should you be making? There might be somebody that's going really, aggressive and trying to underprice, but can you still hold on to your customers with a sticky product and value, or do you need to make any considerations? Are there any extraneous factors to be considered, like regulation? Like, for example, if you're selling to, I worked with this partner last year, iBase Tea, manufacturing execution systems company. that sells primarily to aerospace and defense, and some key government agencies. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, these are among their customers, right? Northrop Grumman. It's very important that they put everything on GovCloud. That's their default hosting option in SaaS, which means that the cost is going to be slightly higher. And that's just a very simple example of what you want to factor in. Um, so, and that's again, as you'll notice on that slide, it's really a little bit different from how you would just simply price a traditional software product. So now, how do you select your set of pricing models? If you've seen the webinars, this slide will absolutely look familiar, but I still wanted to talk through it for a minute, just because, in a SaaS model, we talk about how things are changing and how it's sort of expanding across. If you look at the traditional software model, they generally either had a fully paid upfront contract with recurring service fees, or service and maintenance, service and support, and then you had term licenses, right? So you paid over a 3-year period, you paid X amount each year to create somewhat of a subscription model. Now in SaaS, you can have those longer term contracts, and we often see those in the enterprise space. But at some level, you're factoring in consumption into that, or usage or value to the customer, the way you're pricing. So the product isn't, X thousand dollars for any large customer. You might have more nuanced tiering, what features are being used, what compute might be used, how many users you might have, and all of that. And that starts to become important, because you need to be able to scale at the same pace at which the customer grows, and therefore you're essentially looking at higher cost. And that's why you want to be a little careful, where the term contracts with consumption is used a lot in the marketplace context. So that might be something just to kind of be a little bit nuanced on. On the other end of the spectrum, obviously, we have pay-as-you-go options and freemium. As you can see on the extreme right end, you're really looking at acquisition. You're not so much worried about valuation. You're not so much worried about profitability. You're just really looking at, how do I get those new logos, early stage startups, early growth businesses. That's kind of where you're landing. Get customers to start using your product. You've all heard product-led growth over and over, I'm sure. That's really where you kind of want to come in. Once you have a little bit more of an established product, once you have sort of customers using your product and liking it, you start to move towards the left end. Now, the nuance here is that as a startup, to note is, when investors value your company, the right end is faster adoption or accelerated adoption, whereas the left end gives you the highest valuation, simply because the risk associated with that tranche of revenue is lower when it's contractually secured. And so investors tend to value that more. So it really becomes a fine balance. And if you're not really sure, start with faster acquisition or accelerated acquisition, usage based, and then as customers get used to it, incentivize longer term contracts with more favorable pricing. We'll look at all of this in a minute here with the examples. And one thing to note is that in a lot of times in enterprise software, hybrid is very much a reality. And so sometimes you just have to look at, hey, can I have a base price, and just to make sure I don't go in the red, or I don't lose sleep over how much it's going to cost me depending on how much you use. You'd sometimes see companies do something like an overage cost. So we'll give you everything you can use up to this threshold. Now that becomes important where you're buying managed services. So as an example, I work with a legal discovery software provider based out of Chicago. And what they did was, they have these unlimited large contracts, all you can use for this much, for X million dollars over a period of, 3 years, 5 years, whatever it might be. And essentially what happened was they offer this functionality to transcribe and translate. And when they have this functionality, is a real differentiator for them, because now it allows them to, sell to customers that are not only doing legal cases in English, but in any language practically. So as they've done this, now if you get customers that say have or a specific case that has a litigation that has a lot of discovery in, say, an Asian country, right? You're using up a lot of that Translate. And Translate on the AWS side is purely consumption based. And now if you're giving somebody all you can eat, then that kind of throws it a little off, out of whack. So looking very carefully at, excuse me, any managed services that you might be buying, and understanding, is there a way or is there a scenario in which I can really, overshoot this from a cost perspective, and therefore do I need to put some very specific thresholds in place? So what they've done now is they've said, you can use the product all you want, and you can translate and transcribe X and Y number of documents or videos or whatever that might be. And therefore, they're kind of safeguarding themselves a little bit. And almost always customers will be okay with that because they see it, they get it, it's value to them. So just that nuance here. And one more thing to call out is the freemium model. We hear a lot of this. I find that a lot of companies don't actually fully leverage this to the extent that you can sometimes. In terms of the value of it, it's really acquisition. It really is, in a premium model, you're really looking at acquisition. And what it does is you want a path to convert. Now, I want to call out a difference here, both with free trials and with just a free offering. Sometimes companies will, as you're all aware, do free trials for 2 weeks or 30 days or some fixed amount of time. Or they might do it for a fixed credit amount. So you might say, you have $200 of free usage, and up to this point, you don't pay anything. Now, what happens on the other end of the spectrum is a free offering where a company might build a product as a way to get customers to start using their offerings and then put them on to, the other products in the portfolio. So for instance, like a loss leader, right? A typical, like what's a good example? So Clumio, for example, they have a data protection and data backup and recovery software that they offer as a service, and it's called Clumio Protect. Now they've had a lot of really good traction in the market, but aside from that, they also want to sort of reach out to that early majority, even the late majority. And sometimes the value of that product isn't just obvious, right, for somebody that's new to cloud. So what they've done is they've launched this product called Clumio Discover. And what they do with Clumio Discover is it's a free offering. You never pay for Clumio Discover. It really just allows customers to run Clumio Discover to see how they would, get benefit from Clumio Protect and what are the cost savings and how simple it is and all of that good stuff, right? So it's almost like a showcase for your flagship product. And so that becomes a free offering. Now, freemium lands somewhere in between those two categories where you give somebody a service for free and they use it until they hit a certain point, right? Either users or storage or something like that. Dropbox, great example. They done a really good job with this. There's a number of others that have done this. MailChimp, again, very successful at doing this. Essentially, the rationale here for doing this was a study that was run by David Skok and Matrix Partners. Again, David Skok, I'm sure you heard the name before, really, really good content from him if you're building SaaS. But they did a survey, and what they found was that the cost of acquisition is 4 times more than upsells. And why is this important? Because freemium is the model for acquisition. You're really looking to acquire customers with the freemium model. You're not looking to, if you're looking to drive near-term cash flow or some high revenue growth quickly, freemium is not the model. So it's really based on value to customers. It's really based on getting those users. A lot of the internet companies will do it. Facebook, for example, they'll get the users on, right? Everybody use our product, and then they monetize somewhere differently. So that's another sort of similar strategy, but slightly different flavor of how they're using this. One company that does it really well in our engagements is Dremio. Dremio, we actually worked with them last year, and they launched this year in July. Essentially, they're a SQL data lakehouse, a cool product. Um, they go across very large enterprise. They also sell to very early stage startups. What they have in their pricing model is they have an enterprise for enterprise customers. They have a limited time trial, and they say, you have X number of units, and you can go try this, and after that, you start to pay. Now that's great for mature customers. You don't want to give them freemium anyways. That's kind of where your revenue is going to come from. But they also don't want to leave out this very early stage startup market. And so what they've done is they've said, you can use this for free up until this point of usage. And so the early stage startups are now using Dremio when they're when they're in their very early stages, which essentially means that, if you've used it for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, at that point when you're about to become a paid customer, you're very unlikely that you're going to throw this product away and now go to a different company and then start the process, right? If you're happy with the product, you're just going to continue to use it. That's really the rationale. So you can use both. You can use free trials and freemium. And that's, again, right, going back to that very first slide that we looked at, it really allows you to go across the spectrum with your different customer segments. I'm going to pause there just for a second and ask any questions. Is this helpful? Any comments on how people in this room are doing pricing? All right. Please absolutely use the chat as you're, as I'm speaking. I will pause and, look at the chat as well. And my video, start video sign is still spinning for some reason. I don't know why. All right. So coming to the next piece of, how to define your pricing model, or some of the guidelines at least, defining a billing dimension. Now, this is really at the heart of your pricing model in SaaS. If you don't take anything away from today's presentation, this is one slide that I'd love for you to take away. Really, billing dimensions are, in terms of how you think about it, there are really different buckets of billing dimensions or pricing dimensions. One of them is function based. So, how many features you get access to, how many users might use your product, and so on. Third-party integrations that you get and you can easily integrate with, all of that. Activity based, this ties back to your cost and your consumption. So things like compute, storage, how much cost you incur for each API call, things like that, right? And then bandwidth, if you're looking at a network security product as an example. And then there are subscription models that we just talked about. So freemium, pay as you go, contract with consumption, custom contracts, or what we call private offers here for AWS Marketplace. Now, how do you choose this, right? When you're choosing a pricing dimension, there's just so many different pieces, moving pieces. So how do you choose that? And if this is for anybody that's relatively new to SaaS pricing and SaaS, if this is confusing, we'll walk through an example in just a little bit here. So, and I promise you that'll be easier to follow along. And the theory can be a little vague sometimes. But as you're selecting a pricing dimension, really value for price paid is what you're going for. It's not how much a certain customer is paying just as an absolute, but how much are they paying with respect to or relative to how much value they're getting. If I am a sales, an account manager, I'm in Salesforce all day, every day, right? Whereas if I'm an analyst that's doing some tracking, I'm going and running one report. Now, if it's paid per user, the value to me as an account manager is so much more than if I'm an analyst. Again, tie this back to what we talked about earlier about really diving into those personas and noting where that value is for each persona and what that value is and how much are they willing to pay for it. So, that's kind of why we've seen gradually a move away from just purely per user pricing. When SaaS started in the early days, that was sort of the most common, pay for the number of users or user licenses. We're seeing an active shift away from that. Value metric, one key thing, as sort of just as the holy grail to keep in mind, is as you're pricing your SaaS offering, does a simple rule to check is, as customer usage grows, does value to my business grow, or does my ARR see that reflect? And value to business can be different, right, and depending on what your context is, but I'm using ARR as sort of a proxy here, just as the most common metric. But as customer usage grows, the value to your business should grow. And this ties back to the first point we were talking about, because if I, as a customer, am really using the product day in, day out, and the value I'm seeing from it is obviously a lot, and therefore I'm willing to pay more for it. Now, that ties very closely to churn. Churn is very seldom related just to an absolute price point, but what is the price I'm paying with respect to what value I'm getting, and do I see it as being worth it? So if you do have longer term 1 year, 3 year, 5 year contracts, at the end of that contract period, at the time of renewal, it shouldn't even be a question for me, because if I'm paying for what I use, it's fine. I'm only paying for how much value I'm getting for it. And that's why usage-based pricing is just so, so important. And you'll see it, even if not spelled out in sort of the exposed packaging, you'll see there's some underlying element of it in almost all SaaS companies, particularly B2B SaaS companies. And then frictionless growth. This is the important piece here in terms of how your customers go from using 100 terabytes to 200 terabytes, for example. Remove that friction, make it really, really continuous. So if you're using a system, I, as a user, should not really have to worry about how much I'm using the system. That said, there is a caveat here, which is, if a SaaS provider and a user, you're pushing, and as the user, I'm using a lot of your service, there's someone sometimes in between who's the procurement guy, or the or girl, or the sort of the buyer, if you will. That person is needs to be informed of if you're expecting any significant increases in invoicing, and managing that either through saying, hey, you've signed up for X number of credits, you're 80% through, or some kind of a heads up like that, right? Whether it's in product communication, whether it's an email that you send out, whatever that might be, whatever flavor that might, you might choose to opt for there. You want to have some way of managing that expectation, because you don't want this to be, hey, my invoice turned out to be 3x what I was expecting. SaaS is too expensive. I can't do this. That's another, just something to keep in mind to balance churn. But from a user perspective, you want to make it as easy and as frictionless for users to continue using. And those are really the three factors that you want to take into account when you're building your SaaS pricing model. Now, in terms of the dimensions, this is, so I pulled up end of last year, I pulled up about 928 SaaS companies that are listed on Marketplace and looked at what is the pricing dimension that they're using. You will see that it doesn't matter what the category, whether it's infrastructure software, business applications, or DevOps software, they're all using composite units at least 65% of the times. So at least 65% of the SaaS providers are actually using composite units, which means that the surprise to me was really in business applications. If you looked at how Salesforce priced many years ago, it was a sort of blanket enterprise contract, and then depending on the number of users that were using the product, you really had those licenses, sort of built. But you'll see that there's been a shift away from that, and what people are taking into account is things like consumption, features, convenience, and so things like support, SLAs, all of that is getting factored in that tier. So generally, you'll see a 3 cross N or a 5 cross N or some 3 to 5 is generally the number most common, but you'll see, that's your sort of good, better, best pricing, if you will. And then you have the different parameters that along the y-axis that you can also include. It will show up. I'll talk through the Snowflake example, and you can see that. But also, still 23% of business applications are still using simple per user pricing. And it's important to really think about, is that the right model for you and for what you're trying to do? And obviously, to no one's surprise, infrastructure and DevOps skew towards more consumption-based pricing. Now, in terms of, this is just a couple more slides here before we jump into the example. Determine the optimal unit. Now, one of the most common things we see is, a lot of people, when they're doing SaaS pricing, and this is across the spectrum, whether startup or enterprise, they'll start with cost. What is the cost, and where do I need to be? Now, particularly as a startup, but even just generally, if you think you're launching disruptive innovation in the market, obviously, there is a certain value to it. And that value is not being captured today anywhere in the market. So you just need to take a step back and think, a little bit more creatively about what that value could be. And then think about how do you articulate that value. That's step 2. Now, cost typically starts with cost. That's your lower bound for your pricing model. And then you have the value. So, obviously you're delivering disruptive innovation. You also have complete responsibility to be operating the service. So what is that value that you're bringing? And then, obviously, like any other pricing, SaaS pricing also is you have constraints of the industry. So how are your customers buying? Are there any competitive dynamics? Is one of my competitors pricing very aggressively? Who am I up against? And what are some of the different pricing models? And your pricing model really should land somewhere there, somewhere in between that value to customer and constraints. And you can see how much, far off from cost it is at. Now, one thing also to note is, particularly for startups, when you're trying to do something new, constraints of the industry are, the industry is likely not taking those constraints into account, like that is not solving that problem. So the constraints that apply don't directly necessarily apply to what you might be building. And so you really need to be able to make a case for why your product is, so innovative and why it's bringing so much value. And that is really what gets us into how do you break down cost for your offering, and how do you think of value for your offering. Now, a lot of times in SaaS, this first section that we see here, which is the cost savings or TCO bucket, that's the one that most of my partners and customers generally look at without fail, right? That's something that you're going to get an invoice at the end of the month from AWS, and that's something that you need to sort of factor in. Now, on the cost side of things, there is obviously excuse me, how much is this offering going to cost you to actually run and operate for a given customer? It's important to also take into account that this might be very different depending on who the customer is, even though sometimes they might be paying the same amount. And again, ties it back to make sure that the value they're getting from the product is aligned with how much they're using of the service in terms of consumption, and that is then tied to pricing. Beyond infrastructure cost, what we also recommend you take into account, both for pricing and for cost modeling, is staff productivity. So from a cost perspective on your side, you'll say, hey, I need one SRE and one DevOps engineer and one security specialist to run and operate this product. But on the customer side, so that's cost, right? But on the customer side, the customer would have had to have one security person and one DevOps engineer and one SRE maybe potentially on their side, which they don't have to do now. And what that means is that the value to the customer of you, sort of managing, hosting, maintaining this is much higher than the cost to you. Because your cost is actually essentially split across a number of customers that will benefit from this resource. So that's really the nuance that I'm trying to call out here. A lot of times my customers or my partners will say, hey, this is what it's costing me, and I'm going to translate this into pricing. But actually, that's not the value to the end customer. From an operational resilience, it's really just improved SLAs, making sure there is close to 100% uptime, zero downtime upgrades, all of that. But there's also things like, make sure the right security patches installed and, there's no system vulnerabilities, your OS is the right version, whatever that might be, beyond just staff and productivity costs. Now, one thing to call out here between these two middle buckets is in an on-premise model, for example, the customer will raise a ticket. You have to actually, if you can't solve it remotely, you have to dispatch somebody to go fix it. And there is a certain business value that the customer is getting over there. And that is important in terms of not just the cost for them, that they don't have to now incur any of this operational maintenance and management costs, but there's also the system's not down for 2 days or 3 days if they have a 72-hour SLA. It's you can deliver it like right away. And sometimes in SaaS, the expectation becomes that you will find the issue before your customers even see it or know it, and a fix will be on the way, and you would have at least communicated it, if not fixed it, um, before they find it. And that's really the sort of it's very quickly becoming table stakes in SaaS, and so making sure that you're pricing for it or pricing in that value is important. The last bucket is business agility. This is very specific to your use case again, simply because if you're, say, a Salesforce or a Dremio or one of these companies that I mentioned, you're very likely releasing new products, upgrades, features, bug fixes, some minor enhancements weekly, if not daily. And smaller companies tend to have obviously fewer releases, but just across the board, it's much more frequent. You're probably having a major release at least once every quarter. In an on-premises model, of course, that's not the case, right? You have a big product release in once in 12 months or once in 18 months or something like that. So that is obviously more innovation, but also depending on the industry, like in healthcare, for example, worked with Master Control last year. They sell to the life sciences industry. The life sciences, these labs, they don't want a new version unless they're really happy with it, and they've really looked at it, and they've to their heart's content, verified and validated it. So there are different sort of schedules for how quickly you'll release innovation. It also depends on what's on your product roadmap and how much you're planning to release, regardless of the industry or vertical or use case. Taking that into account, you can absolutely price in agility because now you're delivering additional innovation. And that is really, I think, the crux of how you would think about the guidelines, at least. I'm going to pause there for a second before we jump into an example. Any questions here? Comments, thoughts? Okay, I hope this is helpful. Um, I'll start to talk through the next example, and maybe you guys can tell me if this. Awesome, thanks, Maria. Um, so I think let's look at an example. I've picked Snowflake here, and because I think they address just so many different nuances and use cases, and we'll dive into each of those, and then I leave some time at the end for specific questions if you have any related to where you're at and what you're trying to price currently. So Snowflake, I think most of you might know they IPO'd last year. I think they've been around for about 9 years now, and really seen very, very strong growth. Data warehouse. Okay, let me pause here just for a question. High-level breakdown for DevOps and for infra is pretty similar. Are there striking differences in the details? I can actually look at that and come back to you with that, Efri. I, don't remember from the top of my head the companies, but I think let me go back to that slide actually here. Yeah, so I think, from an infrastructure and DevOps perspective, we basically have I think there is a little bit more of a user element really to the DevOps, I would say, than infrastructure, because infrastructure tends to be more in the background. You're less likely to back up as a service, right? I, as a regular employee, am much less likely to be using the backup service or touching it. So I think the kind of personas are slightly different. The user experience is probably less, aside from, the key buyers and the admins, the day-to-day user experience is probably a little different. And then DevOps, you're probably looking more at um, like a good example is someone like a Checkmarx, right? I mean, they're not necessarily technically DevOps, but that's kind of they're getting they're at that application security layer, and they're likely pricing based on, say, scans or transactions, or I shouldn't say pricing because I think their pricing model is a little different, but at least they're um, you know billing consumption in some way at that level. And so it's a little bit more of the, it could be API based, or it could be um, yeah, they don't. They're very similar in terms of the, because I think where that's coming from is really, if you see the breakdown here, I've combined it quite a bit, and both of those categories are very likely to use composite units. But we can definitely look at that data. I'll send you the links of how I looked at it, and if that's helpful, take a look and tell me, and we can dive into that in more detail. A lot of them generally tend to price with composite units, and that's really why this is kind of converging. It's a really good point. Um, all right, let's go to the example. Um, so Snowflake, and why did I select Snowflake? Because I think they're one of the SaaS companies that has, the last 9 years really gone from brand new startup, doing data warehousing, to this, comprehensive data cloud that's doing so much more, and they've grown so much, and they IPO'd last year. So their pricing model very specifically takes into account a lot of nuance. So let's start with who their buyers are. So they started as a data warehouse. They've obviously expanded now to doing a lot more, including data analytics and integrating with a number of different services and so on. The key buyers for Snowflake are the chief information officer and the data analytics teams. So they're essentially looking at making data analysis really easy. Uh, Verticals, one thing to note here is that essentially they go across a lot of different verticals, right? So technology, healthcare, fintech, a lot of these you'll see they're very different flavors of industries, different types of buyers. And then even in terms of the segments, they sell to pretty much everybody. So your majors are what we had listed as strategics, enterprise, obviously, and then corporate accounts or small medium businesses. So they really span the spectrum, and that's important because then you'll see different flavors of pricing in the same model. Now, from a product pricing and packaging perspective, they package both on demand, which is pure pay as you go, or spend commits, which is what we talked about earlier, which is where they have contracts and you get slightly more favorable pricing depending on the commit. They have 4 different tiers. So we talked about tiers, when I said 3 cross N or 5 cross N, that is essentially, this is 4 cross N here. So standard, enterprise, business critical, and virtual private Snowflake. And then they have usage-based pricing. They have what is called Snowflake credits. They have an add-on storage, and they have data transfer. And I will show you exactly what I mean there. And then they have discounts based on spend commit. This is a really good model when you're breaking down your own pricing, to really just write this down and think, what are all the pieces that need to be taken into account and factored in as sort of just that skeletal framework, and move based on this, then start to do your specific pricing. Now, if you look at how they price, this is what it looks like. Tell me if this is too small, if you guys are not able to see all the details here. But essentially, they have standard. Enterprise is standard, everything in standard plus, business critical is everything in enterprise plus, and so on. Now you'll see one interesting thing. I'm going to just flip over here to Chrome and try to show you what their model actually looks like. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen here. And you should see Chrome now, not the PowerPoint. I'm going to show you how easy they had made it. This is literally the direct, thanks, Christian. This is literally how they've made the experience. You go in here as, somebody who's looking to buy. Now, what they've also done is this is their marketplace listing. And okay, yeah, there it is. So you can see their marketplace listing. It's literally, you see how it's very, very simple. They're catering here to somebody who's just coming in, has landed, and is looking to buy their product. So they're essentially, making it super simple, and they're not giving the user all the different complexity. But then they also have this link here, which is, Snowflake pricing, and that brings you here to this page. When you land here, you can actually select what the platform is that you want, what the region is, which is, say, Northern Virginia, for instance, and you can say USD or US dollars or euros. And the pricing here actually changes. So if you go from, as you can see, the pricing has actually changed. So they're making it, you can not just see the pricing, but also the packaging and how they're sort of really trying to simplify that for their users. And the simplification of pricing is almost as important as the pricing itself. Now you can also see when I said 3 or 4 or 5 cross N, this is your N right here. And so you can see everything that they're getting. So essentially what they're doing is, if you think back to the composite slides, composite units slide that we shared, that I shared from Marketplace, what you'll see essentially is that they are doing per compute, but they're also doing per feature. And you get more as you pay. So that's how they make it composite. And it's so simply packaged, but if you really take a minute to look at this model, you'll see that they are actually, there is just all of these are packaging dimensions, each of these. And can you imagine if the user has to go through and not in a very intuitive sort of flow, look through this and figure it out? It becomes very difficult. So they've really, really optimized this. And then business critical, of course, has things like HIPAA for healthcare, PCI compliance, etc. And it also has things like API, AWS private link support, and so on. Now, I want to show you one other thing here, which is, this is really how that, we talked about credits here. So you saw that they had, oops, okay. Yeah. So you saw that they had, the credit, $2 per credit or $3 per credit. This is really how their their credits are being evaluated. So if you use an excess compute instance, an extra small compute instance, you only consume 1 credit per hour, and 1 credit is $2 if you're buying the standard, and so on, right? So they're kind of going through that. Now there is consumption-based pricing here that you see clearly. There's tiered by compute instances. There is also add-ons. Now this is important to note because when you're looking at a pricing model, as a user, when I'm looking at the pricing, I'll think, okay, Snowflake is billing X dollars per hour and their competitor is billing Y dollars per hour and X is greater than Y. And so I don't really think that it's good because it's expensive. So they're trying to avoid that. They've pulled out storage as an add-on, and they've pulled out capacity storage as an add-on as well. So this is something that you can do if you're not really sure. Networking costs is another common one here. pulling it out and using it separately is easy. Now, one other thing I want to show you is how their marketplace listing has actually evolved. If you looked at their marketplace listing 2 years ago, this is what it looked like. Now you can see that they are billing on compute here per unit. They also have storage per 100 GB here. Now they've pulled out that storage separately and made this super simple for the user. Now, if you look at what their pricing model looks like, we looked at it just a second ago, you can see how much that has changed. And what they've done also is they've moved to, they had this whole credit model, right? This credits model. And that's something that's really gaining popularity now in the industry, where the companies are starting to say, you can buy X number of credits. Now, credits, depending on what service you're using, translate to something different each time. So if you're using, my data warehouse functionality, it's $3 per hour. If you're using my, AI/ML analytics add-on, it's $5 for, some particular action. But from a user perspective, I don't necessarily have to break it down and, break down the nuance of exactly what I will be using. It is more, I can just buy a bulk of credits and use what I use and know that, okay, I have the budget to use this much for the month. So that's really important there. Let me go back to the browser window, and I'll show you a couple other things that I think are important to note. Now, one thing that often comes up in Okay, so one thing that often comes up in SaaS conversations is, how do I think of data transfer costs? So what Snowflake is doing here is there is this detailed pricing guide that you can actually request. And as you go down here, it says, learn more about Snowflake pricing, and there is a pricing guide option here. Now, this is where transparency starts to become really important in SaaS. And you have, if you go click on that link, you come here where there is a whole detailed explanation of everything that you're buying: storage, virtual warehouses or compute, which is what they're billing on, and then cloud services. And as you go down, they actually explain what is a Snowflake credit. They explain all of this below. And additionally, what they're doing is they've all obviously built out serverless, right? So if you're using any of those additional add-on services right here, they're also explaining how that is being factored in. And then they have the 4 different editions and all the detail here. And then if you go down all the way, you'll see what is a data transfer cost for each cloud provider. And so they're actually telling you, the exact pieces that you will be paying for. It's there, but it's just not there at first glance. So when I, as a new customer, new user, land on their marketplace page, which is here, what I see is free trial, continue to subscribe, and a super simple pricing model. That does not mean the pricing model is simple or it's trivial. There is a ton of detail that has gone in here. And sometimes you just cannot estimate things like data transfer costs. And you'll see a lot of companies will just simply pass that on to their customers if, if it becomes a significant piece of their costing. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk through Snowflake here, because they are a really great example for how you can think about pricing across multiple dimensions. And here you can also see that they talk about their add-on pricing, and depending on what region and whether you do it on demand or what, they actually give you your credit pricing here as well. And then this is your capacity. So you see Northern Virginia, they'll tell you the cost for it. So you're able to really easily, even just as a layperson, navigate and understand what is going on. And this is equally important to how you price your product, essentially. And then they have a couple more pricing examples here of how you can, if you're a certain provider, what kind of pricing you see. So I hope that helped clarify all of the concepts that we talked about. Snowflake does not have a freemium model, but they do have a start for free and they have a 30-day trial. So if you click on that, it'll give you this and you can start using your product. And then it'll also say you have $400 worth of free usage. And that's a fairly common model. Yeah, so Effie, it's a good question. That's really where their contracts come in. So providers like Snowflake with large enterprises do a lot through private offers on Marketplace. In fact, in the webinar that I just mentioned earlier, where we had Stripe, Snowflake, and CrowdStrike, both Snowflake and CrowdStrike called out their enterprise. Yeah, yeah. I can see that, Keith. So essentially, what they do is that they have private offers where you can actually have contracts, and those contracts can be, based on how much you're looking to use, and it's essentially like private pricing, and that is priced more favorably for commit. Because the longer you commit to, the more Snowflake values that. And a very high percentage of a lot of these providers, their large deals come through private offers. So you're looking at something like 60 to 70% of large enterprise deals that happen through, if not more, even it might even be closer to 80% for some of them, happen through private offers. So that's kind of how they manage it. Yeah. So one thing I will call out is, as part of pricing also, CrowdStrike actually has called this out a number of times. As a startup, one thing that gets a little tricky is when you're pricing, there's also this whole contractual piece of it. And when you're starting to sign these contracts, there's often pushback from customers saying, hey, how do I know how you're, securing and safeguarding my data, or I can really trust the startup to just not disappear in 6 months or something like that. But what happens is a lot of larger enterprise customers have existing contracts with AWS. So a lot of these providers will also have, integrated all of their billing flows within AWS. So almost all the large or recent IPO startups that I've worked with, so CrowdStrike, Snowflake, Clumio, Dremio, Cohesity, all of these have essentially integrated into the AWS billing flow, which means customers have signed EDPs, they have enterprise contracts. It all goes to them as one combined invoice. So you're not getting one for Clumio, one for Cohesity, one for Dremio. It's all going in as one invoice. And the enterprise contracts have been used, not just to accelerate adoption, but also to significantly reduce sales cycle. So CrowdStrike, actually, the CEO, George Kurtz, called it out and said, for large enterprise customers, it cuts their sales cycles by about 50%. And recently, Jessica Alexander, also from CrowdStrike, said just overall what they're seeing currently across the board is about a 33% reduction in sales cycle with enterprise contracts and private offers. And I can tell you Snowflake does a lot of those. Any other questions? I know we have about 6 minutes here. I'd love to hear also from this group here. I mean, each of you is part of a really exciting startup. I looked up, each one of the companies and last evening as I was preparing, and super interesting. So how are you guys doing pricing, and, anything that you're doing differently, or anything that's worked or not worked? Any other examples that might be helpful for me to share with you, or any other specific use cases that you guys need to are interested in knowing more about? It's really quite amazing that my start video thing is still spinning. It's been over an hour here. Gotta just love Chime. All right. Any questions, comments?
So, so you're basically recommending setting up a credit system in order to avoid problems with the AWS pricing model later on. So sometimes it's very difficult to predict the actual costs on AWS itself.
Yeah.
And for example, when we've got a database, then you don't know how much the customer is really using. Yeah, how often he's accessing the database, how much data he's going to store in there.
Yeah.
And from which region he's using the databases, etc. So it's very difficult to estimate any prices in advance. So your advice is to simply tell them to buy some credits in advance, and then whether he use it to store a lot of data or whether to use it to access the data a lot of times from all over the world is up to the user, more or less.
Yeah, no, Jörg, thank you for bringing that up. It's a really good question. It's one we get a lot of times. So just to clarify, this is just one model. The credits model is just one of many models. I was just sharing it here as an example that Snowflake does. Where a credits model becomes interesting is, again, you can have prepaid or postpaid credits. There's nothing to say that you cannot have an invoice at the end and pay it just like you would for any other usage. Credits becomes interesting when you have different flavors of offerings. So you have, let's say you have a storage product, and on top of that you have an analytics service, and on top of that you have some executive dashboards. When you look at those, how you price each of those can be different. The pricing unit or dimension can be different, and the price point will obviously be different. When you have credits, what you do is you say, it's literally like you're setting a budget in some way. So it can be prepaid, paid ahead of time, or it can be very much postpaid, paid later. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to abstract the specific consumption unit. And you're trying to say, you have this much budget that you've purchased. So let me take Dremio as an example. They have what is called Dremio compute units, and they don't transfer the data from the customer account to their account. They let the data be in the customer account. The way they have architected it is they have a centralized control plane that every time there is a SQL query from the customer, they spin up compute engines in the customer account, and then they process that. So they don't have a storage element, unlike Snowflake, but they do have compute. And what they do is it's literally just direct compute units that they're pricing on. But they have abstracted it off into, say, this is Dremio compute units, so DCUs. The reason that's important is because if Dremio adds different services on top of that, it makes it easier for them. That's all. You can build directly on the consumption unit, no problem. That's one thing. The second thing that you asked is about estimating cost, particularly in the early stages. Now, when you launch a SaaS product, this is almost universal. You really don't know what that usage will look like. And so it'll take anywhere between 9 to 18 months, in my experience, to really get even a fair sense of what what that very sort of high level benchmark for usage for different customer tiers will look like. And one, you can start with refactoring, sort of factoring in some of that early customer data and saying, excuse me, I ran these 5 beta customers, and the 2 large customers had usage approximately this much. This is roughly what it's going to cost me. And you're kind of looking at almost an 80-20. if you have any kind of customer on-premise data, or if you have some sense of what data they might put, getting those early benchmarks with some of the friendly customers is helpful. But it's exactly correct. There is no easy way to just knowing when you're launching a service, this is exactly how much it's going to cost me. In which case, you simply go with a usage model. MariaDB does that, right? They have a pure usage model, and they'll just charge for, they do use private link for data transfer, and I believe they price that out separately. Couchbase, I worked with them. They IPO'd a few months ago, and they actually just launched their SaaS product yesterday. And what they do is they bill, they use a credit system, and they use, sort of that the core consumption, but they also have the data transfer cost pulled out separately. And that's what I was showing you with Snowflake as well, right? Because data transfer is one of the most unpredictable costs sometimes. And so sometimes you just simply pass that on to your customer, and depending on how much data they transfer, that's just how much they pay. And as the industry is getting a little bit more mature, that's starting to be more accepted. But yeah, no. And just to clarify to the group, right, this is just, I've spoken to all this just as an example. If you're working on a specific pricing use case, please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to individually review any or all of those cost or pricing considerations and models and provide feedback. I understand that pricing is a very nuanced topic, and it's just so hard to provide generic recommendations. So to your point, no, I'm not recommending one model for everyone. It's very, very nuanced to the use case. This is just an effort to provide some high-level guidance on what are the different things to really think about in the SaaS pricing model. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thanks.
All right, I know we're 2 minutes over. Any other questions? All right, I will take that as a no, but I'm going to just drop my email here in the chat, or any of the Oded, Oren, or Thomas can also connect you with me. If you guys are working on anything, please, absolutely anytime, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to discuss the pricing and cost model estimation, whether at launch or going forward. And also feel free to connect on LinkedIn. And I check my LinkedIn pretty frequently, so if you have difficulty getting hold of me via email, then definitely LinkedIn will work as well. And yeah, with that, thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I think this is the last session for today, so have a good evening, and thanks a lot for your time. And hopefully this was helpful. So if you have any feedback, please absolutely feel free to share that as well. Good, bad, what worked, what didn't work, and we'll make sure we align with that.